Hello.
Hello. Hi,
Uh,
Marlon.
Hello, Glenna. How are you?
I'm doing well today, thank you, in the summer heat of North Carolina.
Yes, well, hello from Berlin, and thank you for accepting this interview for Dance Tech TV. And I think that we will use it in some of the Met Academy uh, projects that upcoming will also be dedicated to our common interest in
Lovely.
relation with cognition and the body and embodiment and perhaps somatic practices. But yes, I would like to really talk in this interview about this. What does it mean?
Hi, baby.
Yes, your baby. And this is actually I'm really happy of all the resonance how I was telling you of that I find in this book. I think is it was needed to have this research and the kind of aggregation of so many uh, sources and references and connection about the book is called Body and Mind in Motion, Dance and Neuroscience in Conversation.
Mhm.
And thank you, very nice to have it. And also very nice that you talk about dance tech on it. Yeah, thank you. And we have been historicized. So, just tell us about the book and this this work in the
Well,
book and what motivated you to write it.
this book really started about 20 years ago or more, maybe 25. I have been in the somatics field. I've been in dance really from the late 60s,
Mm-hmm.
um, as a serious professional endeavor. I wanted to write a book at that time about the intersection between somatics and dance.
Mm-hmm.
And I started writing many, many pages and realized that a huge piece was missing, and it was the science. I think my whole career has been this intersection between those three things. And I felt as if the just somatics and dance, first of all, the dialogue was itself so new in those
Mm-hmm.
earlier days. And to try to find the language to describe, what that was, I found myself pulling strings from here
Mm-hmm.
and there, trying to get a baseline for what this was. And there was at least some philosophy and phenomenology that
Mm-hmm.
underscored what dance and somatics was all about, and certainly social theory, cultural theory, all of that was really starting to come up in dance scholarship, which was fantastic in many ways. But I was trained really in science, in neuroscience, trained as a physical therapist, and I wanted to come with a science that was not positivist in tone or theme.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it wasn't really very well explicated. And so I just parked the idea for quite a number of years until I myself felt I had lived long enough, experienced long enough, gotten in contact long enough. You got to realize that back then there was no email,
Mm-hmm.
there were computers were dinosaurs compared to what they are now. There was no Skype, there was no nothing, and there was a sort of unidisciplinary concept of what dance could be. And
Mm-hmm.
now
Yeah.
seeing that, in a way, dance and movement studies are kind of at the center of our existence, and
Mm-hmm.
that all of their movement is giving rise to thinking. And so we now have this amazing dialogue. It's not even a dialogue because it's not between two people. It's
Mm-hmm.
a megalog, um,
Mm-hmm.
megalog of many disciplines, many
Mm-hmm.
people, many things, all going on that really are talking about cognitive studies,
Mm-hmm.
and dance and cognitive studies really relate. And I chose the title neuroscience only
Mm-hmm.
because it was a an easier way for people to comprehend how I would come
Exactly.
into this book.
Yeah.
Um, it was less cumbersome to say dance and cognitive studies in
Yeah.
conversation
Woo.
than neuroscience. So I'm using that term neuroscience quite
Yeah.
loosely. And I
Yeah,
really
and
talk.
you make a clarification, really. Can you tell us a little bit of that kind of broader scope where you include embodiment then?
Yes, of course. Well, the book is really a series of perspectives.
Yeah.
It's where I'm coming from, and I have a person who also assisted me in writing this book, Margaret Wilson, who is with the dance and theater department in the University of Wyoming. And we decided from our collaborations of several years of working with research together that there were a number of themes that were surfacing in the dance world that could be anchored a little bit more concretely, both in embodied cognitive neuroscience and in somatics as well. And so the three could, with dance, could come together a little bit more easily. So we chose a number of themes that were sort of new on the table in a way, meaning new on the table in terms of looking at the scientific perspective that could come into dance. And I wanted also to really, if you will, privilege somatics in a way. Somatics at once has been very well integrated into dance in many ways, in technique and performance and pedagogy and this and that. And at the same time, I mean, within 1 year ago, I would mention the term somatics in a class, and nobody had ever heard that term. Nobody. And it was like, how can dancers not have heard the term somatics? But still, it was unknown.
Yeah.
So I thought, it's time to give it, to bring it back to the table in light of all these other things that are happening, in light of all these other trends. So that's why in the book I have, I focus really on embodiment. In action, which I use as a sort of more agency term for kinesthesia, and then attention. And I talk about ways in which somatics is a form of embodied attention training, so that we are at once training the body, but what do we mean by training the body? We mean we're training the body-mind, and that what it is a form of attending to sensations and the way in which sensation can lead movement and evolve thinking at the same time, because of course perception is motion and all of that. So,
and of course we are throwing or trying to kind of eliminate that kind of very kind of rigid dichotomy of thinking and motion or body mind. It's like practically you're talking always about the complex body mind of the complex thinking action.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's a very interesting thing, that because I think that perhaps even if there had been a lot of influence of somatics within the dance field, something that I started noticing in a very informal way, it was how there was this kind of fetishization of the somatic experience, as if you are not talking about a more global cognitive approach, and certain kind of maintaining that split between, that's abstraction and that's action as a separate things.
Yes, and so it was really important. In the book at the end, there's a series of reflective questions and a series of exercises, simple as they may be or whatever, but I felt as if the explorations that we put at the end with those reflections were ways of saying, we're still working with a dichotomous language, and we're still in many ways practicing, as if we are split. And as much incredible scholarship is out there, as much incredible technology has also become embedded in all of this conversation and shown itself to be embodied, and extending the body in that way. I wanted to show that we need to be taking this conversation into the larger framework of what I call I say that there's a number of things that begin with E that we can discuss: embodiment, embeddedness, enmeshment, emergence, extension through technology and other forms, empathy. We're looking at a series of E's,
That's great.
which in a sense, kind of provide a framework, and I tried to show that in the book. They provide a certain framework for where we can begin to look at how we can start to use language again in ways that can be both analytical and at the same time embedded in praxis. And what is that for dance? And so, it was the hardest thing for me was to figure out to what audience of dance am I pitching this to? Because in many ways, there have been, a number of dancers at the PhD level that, certainly are, looking at these topics in their own way. There's journals being proliferated, Journal of Dance and Somatic Studies, and, all these different ones. I felt as if I wanted to really write to at once the highest level, but not exclude people who were just coming in to get a sense of what these topics were all about. Yeah. So I tried to use language that at once was user-friendly and at the same time referencing it pretty heavily for those who were at the higher level to be able to take that somewhere on their own. Yeah. And this was the approach I took. And it meant writing chapters sometimes 40 times.
Yes, I can see, and I feel like sometimes they have like this really kind of reduced kind of knots, because in a way it's like, okay, everything is here. It's almost like posing a question, at the end, it's like, well, this is what it had been said, and it's probably. And I can feel like how careful, it's like how to articulate the thought.
Yeah, we say at once in the beginning that we are, Euro and American centric in terms because this is all we know, and at the same time, there's a couple of chapters that are what I would call in a colloquial language, cliffhangers. We leave people kind of hanging like, okay, so what do you do with this? And I say, well, what do you do with this? This is where we are now, to my perspective on this. And so, at the same time, it gives, I think that's a pretty good way of ending these chapters because in the end, the final one of the final chapters is really kind of a summary of the road forward. What are some questions we can ask ourselves to take something that looks like a fragmented discourse, so to speak, and really give it more shape so that it can come both into the academy and certainly function outside of the academy in ways that take people forward and, go beyond discourse, if you will, so that we keep, again, bringing movement and dance and the creation of movement and dance into the center of this, burgeoning series of conversations and allow us to me, movement is how gives rise to thinking, is how we think, is embedded in all we think, and so I want dance to still have that center place.
Exactly. But one of the interesting things is like when we are talking about this conversation in between certain fundamental epistemic shifts in relationship to cognition. Sometimes I felt like, well, it doesn't matter how you do your research. It's actually in your epistemology that this is aiming to a huge radical reversal and shifts in which, because it's practically saying, okay, I know that the dinosaurs existed, but I keep believing in Adam and Eve. So it's up to you, right? So how are we going to do with that? Because that's what had been one of the problems that I feel like is practically there are this at least one of the before the last evidences that cognition is a process that is embodied, grounded in the context and the grounded cognition, and also is distributed in relationship to the elements of cognition and in the system. So, and I think that's almost it's already a given, I would say. It's just right there. So how do we manage to keep believing in other things, or how do you see this articulation of the discourses in the research that perhaps it will be totally against a lot of the beliefs that perhaps even the somatic community articulates in relationship to sometimes almost pseudo-religious thinking that is, it
Yes.
had been pervasive in a lot of the, in my opinion, somatics community.
Yes, it's such an interesting question. I think first of all, I think praxis has to be the thing that drives theory and not the other way around.
Exactly. Okay.
That would be one way of thinking that. I mean, I have this little quote in the book from Yogi Berra, who is a very well-known baseball player in America from the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he says, "In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is." You know, and I
Yeah.
thought that's perfect.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
if we keep praxis as driving theory, but we take theory as a touchstone, and we keep using that language, using those concepts. I mean, to really inspire and confirm, affirm, what we are doing, and vice versa. Of course, I think it's easier, for us to use that than for science to say what we're doing is affirming that. But at the same time, I think that we do, and we need to keep in mind those power structures, of course. But I think that practice will give us an enormous basis out of which to start to hone our language in such a way that is no longer sheerly a personal narrative. It becomes a much more shared sense of idea. It may be that personal narrative in the sense of being able to practice these things, but at the same time, we can go to a meta level of discussion and say, this is a shared thing that we can actually search and research in such a way that the research becomes, something that we can both write about, make into digital documentaries of one kind or another, share and take us forward so that we're not restricted so much. I mean, when I look at embodied cognitive neuroscience, especially cognitive science, you see that there's a struggle between to what degree is embodiment really the basis of thinking, that to what degree is that, and there's like several levels at which this is going into dialogue, especially with the information about artificial intelligence and robotics and so forth. And so, it's sort of like, well, is movement simply an addendum to thinking, or is it a result of thinking, or, like, where do we start? And, we start to reframe questions in a way that say, in fact, but for, as Maxine Sheets Johnstone would say, the sensate, tactile, kinesthetic, animated body, there would be no thought, and so, we look at that developmental through line from which we come, and all of our experiential knowledge that Varela talked about, Francisco Varela, and his concept of cellular intelligence and autopoiesis, that from our very biological existence we are intelligent, and it is through movement, sensing, moving, experiencing that then thinking becomes. And I don't know if I really answered your question.
No, like that's I think that is what he also talks is about the complexity of this kind of dialogical relationship between a practice that is de facto embodied and a thought that is de facto embodied, always. And then, and in a way, it's difficult to understand or see what is first. And the other thing that I felt that is very relevant is like, until what point do you think that certain historical deconstructions or practices that happens in the 70s were foreseeing certain theoretical or epistemic shifts that perhaps they were already present in Zen Buddhism, or or alluded in other models of mind? Because one of the things that is beautiful about the book is, okay, you go toward explaining an action, but definitely you have gone through whatever we have thought a mind is or intelligence is what it has been shifting. And
Yes.
then I remember I took a class with Jeremy Nelson probably in the 1989 in Venezuela, and he had a book that was called The Thinking Body.
Oh,
And I was
yes.
like, oh, I think it was
Thanks,
Mabel
Todd.
Todd. And anyway, and I just felt like even that is like as a framework of our practice, it has been extremely relevant. It's like how has been moving in relationship with what we think intelligence entitles. And
Yes.
then, science has been building in parallel and with trade, with a lot of trades, I think, with the dance community. Now we
Yes.
see it kind of more bigger, but
Yes.
definitely there was I think that. So how do you see that connection? Just to make it as a question.
Goodness. Well, I'll sort of limit it just to talking about that chapter about inaction, because I think that's the chapter that best sort of outlines what you're describing, the sort of historical through line between somatics, dance, and science. In that chapter, I talk about positivist views of kinesthesia. From where did we come? And the reason I do that is because I was, pretty much a pioneer in the dance science movement. I was at the first conference. I was on the board of the International Association of Dance Medicine Science. We were all trying to look at, how to bring science into dance and dance into science, and struggling valiantly to bring somatics onto the table against, certain positivist views. So, I talk about kinesthesia, and how it's, without certain ways of, looking at kinesthesia from a positive view, we certainly wouldn't have medical science as it is today, but at the same time, we have a phenomenological view of kinesthesia that also started to evolve, and many dance phenomenologists that started to come in to describe kinesthesia and this sort of sense of kinesthetic consciousness. So we're looking, at Maxine Sheets Johnstone and Sandra Frawley and Susan Lee Foster. I mean, just to give a a brief view of many people who looked at this, and at the same time, Francisco Varela started talking about inaction as bringing forth reality through experience. Back in the late 1960s, with Umberto Maturana, his mentor, and then the somatic movement sort of simultaneously growing up in the 70s and talking so much about sensory awareness and kinesthesia and all of these things. So I start to bring in inaction because inaction is action. We were saying looking less at this idea of kinesthesia as a sense modality or even as a sense of consciousness, but rather an agency, something that comes forth that is, very active, so that you see the reciprocity of sensing and acting. And once again, these are reciprocal things, and one induces the other. Movement induces sensing, sensing induces movement. Sensing induces thinking, thinking induces sensing. And
also it's beautiful that you can see that in the work of Bonnie Beamish Cohen. When she talk about directly, there is no sensing without action.
That's right. And her book, Sensing, Feeling, and Action, which during all this time of evolution of dance science, was like so forward-looking and pioneering in its way, because her work was such and is such. As far as I was concerned, I needed to bring in some history into the conversation in a way that these things that we're talking about, kinesthesia, embodiment, attention, that, really started to say, this is not new. Discussions are not new. They go back many, many, decades. I mean, look at, the somatics and dance, dialogue, that's, half a century old already, at least. But at the same time, what we're constantly faced with is the limitations of our language and our own personal epistemology and beliefs, as you said. And so we need to look once again at science as, at a pioneering science, like what Varela was was advocating, and the more embodied cognitive people who came after him, as well as revisit our own views of what we think about in kinesthesia and embodiment, because we have our own biases, if you will, our own perspectives that also need revisiting in view of all of the different ways we're bringing this history forward. I just didn't want people to forget that there were threads and through lines back even in the 70s we had a glimpse of that, but somehow in the incredible explosion of what came after that in terms of dance, digital technology, this, that, and the other thing, that we lose our origins very easily. We lose our origins. And I mean, even this summer, I went to the Dance Legacies Forum in Ireland and presented on my imagery research. And I had to say, there's 80 years of imagery research in dance, looking at Mabel Todd, Lulu Swigart, and all the people who came before that, sports psychology and so forth and so on, about how images create movement and movement creates imagery, the reciprocity of that again. And it was really important for me to trace that legacy. And I was the only person presenting in that conference that sort of had, talked about science in a way. That was saying, there is science. We just sort of got bogged down in certain ways of looking at it, at science being able to make itself available to us, at science taking on dance as a field of study, which was at first incredibly difficult. Those bridges, trying to cross those bridges were not easy. We were looking at dance from its dysfunction, like when someone gets injured, and then we would bring in science. But no, I mean that actually there's a whole other way of looking at it phenomenologically and saying, in fact, once cognitive science and neuroscience and neuropsychology began to align with phenomenology, then we've got a way in. We've got a table at which we all can sit and discuss these things.
Yes, and of course one of the main challenges is how we and them learn a common language, or we try to clear, a lot of the languaging that happens when we are talking. And I think that has been one of the main difficulties. And of course, you name several projects, that, for example, like the whole work of all the work of Oscar de la Junta. I think that has been enormously influential in relationship to keep at it, kind of like, okay, bringing also cognition as a framework for understanding choreographic practices in this case.
Well, it's so interesting because I think back. I studied with Robert Ellis Dunn, who has sadly left us a little too early in life, but for my purposes. But this was back in the 70s, and he said, we really live in a poverty of movement, and I have never forgotten that phrase, and thought to myself, even today, in spite of this enormous, explosion of dance on every level. Right. I mean, digital technology for the lay person is actually, constraining their movement. Scientists don't really study dance except under very unusual circumstances. And to create these dual competencies, so to speak, where we really, understand each other's language in a way that we can go forward is certainly happening. But the frontier, we're at the frontier.
That it just reminded me of one of the kind of experiences that I found really odd is like in probably 98, I was like talking about all these things about embodiment and embodied cognition, and people in New York were like, you're crazy. But then I wrote a paper, a rambly paper, and I sent it to a conference called Towards the Science of Consciousness that is in Tucson, and it was cybernetic. It was improvisation as a cybernetic art. So I was like tracing a little bit the influence of information theory and system theory on improvisation. But then I met in the table when we were presenting, and the funny thing that I was presenting with my Susan Marshall and Company tag. I was not, I never been kind of a formal scholar, but I was a dancer from the Susan Marshall and
This
Company
is so
and
great.
dancers. And then I was like this guy from Oxford and this other guy from different universities, philosophers. And then one of them was presenting the influence of J.J. Gibson on the understanding of virtual reality.
Ah.
He was using the J.J. Gibson framework of ecological psychology to understand when would you have goggles, and you need to integrate that information with your kinesthetic system. And then when suddenly you change the, let's say, the horizon inside the virtual world, the person falls down, without nothing. It's like literally the visual feedback knocks you down. So I found that so revealing, because I felt, wow, these people who study games is
Uh-huh.
actually really using a lot of this very highly sophisticated somatic integration thinking in relationship with J.J. Gibson and embodied cognition. So that was quite revealing for me in relationship to certain thing that I was seeing in the dance world, a lot of kind of phobia to this kind of approaches, even if we were talking about the New York lineage with a lot of cognitive influence. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I felt like that's something that, of course, includes now the notion of technology. That in technology, a lot of people who has that you name some on the book, like Sean O'Hennessy, I
Balfour.
think, that
Yeah.
they work with, mostly embodied interaction in
Yes.
human-computer interaction. They had to really understand how we moved,
Yes.
so and how we interact. Somatically or with an embodied perspective. So anyway, so I think that it's interesting how we dancers sometimes have left this kind of technology or digitality outside. But for me, it was when I started witnessing, I was like, wow, the people who's working with virtual reality is actually thinking in a quite sophisticated way in
Yeah.
relationship to the body.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, the hard part, which we still face, is that the language of science can be somewhat off-putting, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, of
and,
course.
and vice versa.
Yeah,
That all
yeah.
our sort of, heavily personal, whatever, a
Hmm.
feeling state language,
Yeah,
sensate language,
yeah.
is off-putting, to science, and we need something that it once describes, the celestial orbs that lie in the outer galaxy are the same thing as twinkle twinkle little star, that we're really sort of saying this, we're talking this, we're trying to put across the same idea.
Yeah.
But I forget who the scholar is that wrote that contemporary modern or whatever science is has a certain kind of similarity to the 17th century courtier,
Mm.
where there's a certain distancing and there's a certain posing and there's
Mm.
a certain language that creates this kind of distance that is all part of the culture of
Mm.
science.
Yeah.
And um, and it's just something that I think we all need getting used to. And it would be wonderful to have, a seminar just on that. Like, how can we bridge these languages and bring movement in and have, dancers and scientists sort of, the
Yeah.
scientists could make up movement and the dancers could make
Yeah.
up movement and vice versa. I mean, it would be fantastic to just
Yeah,
sort of like,
what I see is like a much more accepting in both sides, meaning the dance field and the scientists in general, is practically the primacy of biology, is the primacy of, in a way that we're understanding that we are living systems
mm-hmm,
and or living creatures and also is the going back to the materiality. It's like it's a very clear materiality of
yes,
embodiment, and then within that weird materiality there is subjectivity. So, and that is, I think, one of the, I think, really important shifts, because we're talking about a very important shift in even what we think about humanities. What are the humanities? Is what does it mean to really have universals because one of the things that sometimes is forbidden to talk about is that perhaps there are some biological universals. And in our community, and in a very traditional, in a very scholar tradition, it was forbidden. And you talk in your book about the consilience. That term, is E.O. Wilson, who was literally banned from the humanities for a while.
Indeed. Yeah.
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 So I think that it's a very interesting, hopefully fertile opportunity to have a fertile dialogue in relationship to how do we sit between the political and at the same time certain characteristics of our embodiment.
Yeah, well, I do think that there's some language there that both worlds can accept very nicely. Like instead of subjectivity, we use the word interaction, which in a way takes this, the sort of first person, third person thing out of it. And I'm confident that this is happening and will continue to happen. That of course, we all need to. Scientists shouldn't be dancers, and dancers shouldn't be scientists. I mean, we should pursue our own disciplines and evolve them in ways that make sense for us. At the same time, the mutual inspiration is certainly important, and that as we go forward, once again, to use one of Varela's favorite terms, we would bracket our prepositions, our suppositions, our biases, our beliefs, and just really engage fully in learning something from one another. And that was sort of another reason why I wrote the book. I thought, well, if any inroad can be made, by stepping out, leaping off the mountain, as I feel I've done in doing this, then this is our hope, and that hope may lie at the basis of our humanity. Without that, we cannot be human.
Well, that is I think for one of the things that is very hard, and this is just to finish, is how do you. Because I would say the proposition of enaction is extremely important in relationship to perhaps what we think and what we know in relationship to grounded cognition. Okay, so one of the tenets is that cognition as such comes from a closed system, and I think that was a very, very revolutionary and radical proposition in relationship to. You have a system, let's say our body, that enacts, but is actually is rubbing with reality, but not actually assimilating anything in. And I think that I tried to explain once that in I think at the Somatics and Technology Conference in the UK last year, and I had a lot of resistance with that, because it's like, no, we receive in, So then I just felt, my God, is the epistemology again, the model that okay, people is thinking with an informational model about that we actually receive information inside our body. Do you know what I mean? So that then there was this kind of, I've noticed that in somatics and certain aspects in the discussion, there was this mashup of models. It was systems through Bonnie Bembridge, some kind of access consciousness through Buddhism, a little bit of complexity and emergence, and a little bit of something, and then how they thought that, or was proposed this, that the body then is actually receiving information. And I was like, wow, how do we go to try to at least say, well, at least propose to this embodied cognition enactive model, there is no information coming in. It's actually some, I would call like rubbing or something. Or so how, it's a hard question, but
I think one way of answering it is that, we have to stop thinking of receptivity as passive, that, to receive, in order to be reached, something in you must open to be reached, And so we're not just reaching, we're not just, acting in the world. I mean, having come from years of Alexander technique study,
Yeah.
especially, we're not just doing all the time,
Yeah.
and
Not
making our
receiving.
fun world.
Yeah.
But it is that rub, that is the interface, the interdigitation, the, integument of our existence that at once allows us to be reached. And when we are reached, we can act at our best, is sort of when we are fully in that, reciprocal receiving acting mode, that we really are at our best. We're not just, the sort of, just thinking of acting alone is, first of all, exhausting to me.
Yeah.
Secondly, also gives me a sense that, once again, we're putting power at the center of who we are, as opposed to putting empathic resonance at the center of who we are. And I think, that it has a whole cultural, socio-cultural overlay that we need to examine carefully in order to answer the question as fully as both of us might like it to be answered.
Yeah, no, I think that, of course, the question of agency is crucial in relation to analysis of the system. And one of the beauty of this is, like, when a lot of improvisational practices were developed in the 60s and 70s, I think that they were reflecting this epistemology. So that's one of the weird things. It's like how the practice was adapted to actually the theoretical pullings that a lot of the practitioners start doing were adapted to the practice that required real-time understanding of the real-time process. So you needed to have a totally different epistemology.
That's right.
You know what I mean? So that's what I think that the cognitive turn start happening. It's just because the other models were not facilitating.
Indeed. I mean, they all took us out of
itself.
space-time reality. Trying the positive model took us as furthest away from that as possible, and just tried to put, us in some kind of isolation chamber in order to examine what was happening. And it couldn't have been further from the actual thing that needed to be done, which was to study it in its real environment. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We can talk for hours.
That's true. Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
And, I hope that we can continue the conversations and that we can perhaps do something quite specific about these topics on Meta Academy. And so whenever, we are to your disposition.
Well, I thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a complete pleasure, and I would absolutely love to participate at any time. So my door is open.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you,
Thanks,
and
Miles.
let's keep going.
Okay.
Motivated you to write it?
This book really started about 20 years ago or more, maybe 25. I have been in the somatics field. I've been in dance really from the late 60s, as a serious professional endeavor. I wanted to write a book at that time about the intersection between somatics and dance. And I started writing many, many pages and realized that a huge piece was missing, and it was the science. I think my whole career has been this intersection between those three things. And I felt as if just somatics and dance, first of all, the dialogue was itself so new in those earlier days. And to try to find the language to describe, what that was, I found myself, pulling strings from here and there, trying to get a baseline for what this was. And there was at least some philosophy and phenomenology that underscored what dance and somatics was all about, and certainly social theory, cultural theory, all of that was really starting to come up in dance scholarship, which was fantastic in many ways. But I was trained really in science, in neuroscience, trained as a physical therapist, and I wanted to come with a science that was not positivist in tone or theme. And at the time, it wasn't really very well explicated. And so I just parked the idea for quite a number of years until I myself felt I had lived long enough, experienced long enough, gotten in contact long enough. You know, you got to realize that back then there was no email, there was no computers were, you know, dinosaurs compared to what they are now. You know, there was no Skype, there was no nothing, and there was a sort of unidisciplinary concept of what dance could be. And now seeing that, you know, in a way, dance and movement studies are kind of at the center of our existence, and that, you know, all of their movement is giving rise to thinking. And so we now have this amazing dialogue. It's not even a dialogue because it's not between two people. It's you know, a megalogue, megalogue of many disciplines, many people, many things, all going on that really are talking about cognitive studies, you know, and dance and cognitive studies really relate. And I chose the title neuroscience only because it was a you know, an easier way for people to comprehend how I would come into this book. It was less cumbersome to say dance and cognitive studies.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Marlon.
Hello, Glenna. How are you?
I'm doing well today, thank you, in the summer heat of North Carolina.
Yes, well, hello from Berlin, and thank you for accepting this interview for Dance Tech TV. And I think that we will use it in some of the Met Academy projects that upcoming will also be dedicated to our common interest in relation with cognition and the body and embodiment and perhaps somatic practices. But yes, I would like to really talk in this interview about this. What does it mean?
My baby.
Yes, your baby. And this is actually really happy of all the resonance, how I was telling you, that I find in this book. I think it was needed to have this research and the kind of aggregation of so many sources and references and connection about. The book is called Body and Mind in Motion, Dance and Neuroscience in Conversation. And thank you, very nice to have it. And also very nice that you talk about dance tech on it. Yeah, thank you. And we have been historicized. So just tell us about the book and this work in the book and what.
Neuroscience. So I'm using that term neuroscience quite loosely. You know, and
can you make a clarification? Really, can you tell us a little bit of that kind of broader scope where you include embodiment then?
Yes, of course. Well, the book is really a series of perspectives. It's where I'm coming from, and I have a person who also assisted me in writing this book, Martha Wilson, who is with the dance and theater department in the University of Wyoming. And we decided from our collaborations of several years of working with research together that there were a number of themes that were surfacing in the dance world that could be anchored a little bit more concretely both in embodied cognitive neuroscience and in somatics as well. And so the three could, with dance, could come together a little bit more easily. So we chose a number of themes that were sort of new on the table in a way, meaning new on the table in terms of looking at the scientific perspective that could come into dance. And I wanted also to really if you will, privilege somatics in a way. You know, somatics at once has been very well integrated into dance in many ways, in technique and performance and pedagogy and this and that. And at the same time, I mean, within 1 year ago, I would mention the term somatics in a class, and nobody had ever heard that term. Nobody. And it was like, how can dancers not have heard the term somatics? You know, but still, it was unknown.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, it's time to give it to bring it back to the table in light of all these other things that are happening, in light of all these other trends. So that's why in the book I have, you know, I focus really on embodiment, inaction, which I use as a sort of more agency term for kinesthesia, and then attention. And I talk about ways in which somatics is a form of embodied attention training, so that we are at once training the body, but what do we mean by training the body? We mean we're training the body-mind, and that what it is a form of attending to sensations and the way in which sensation can lead movement and evolve thinking at the same time, because of course perception is motion and all of that. So,
and of course we are throwing or trying to kind of eliminate that kind of very kind of rigid dichotomy of thinking and motion or body mind. It's like practically you're talking always about the complex body mind of the complex thinking action.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's a very, very interesting thing, that even because I think that perhaps even if there had been a lot of influence